Coming up on the program, U.S. election security officials reject President Donald Trump's fraud claims. France remembers victims of 2015 Paris attacks amid renewed Islamist threats. And war crimes feared in Ethiopia's Tigray as Amnesty reports massacre. Welcome to the program. I'm Joker Rogers. U.S. federal election officials have rejected President Donald Trump's fraud claims, saying instead that 2020 White House vote was the most secure in American history. The Committee of Election Officials spoke out after Mr. Trump claimed without proof that 2.7 million votes for him were deleted in last week's election. He's yet to concede to the projected winner, Democrat Joe Biden. The result was projected by U.S. media last weekend, but vote counting continues in some areas. Mr. Biden has also been projected as the winner of Arizona, granting him 11 more electoral college votes. It's the first time the state has voted Democrat since 1996. Well, after nearly a week of silence, China has finally congratulated Joe Biden as president-elect of the United States. In a statement, China says, "We respect the choice of the American people. We extend congratulations to Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris." Until this point, the Chinese government had been holding out, saying only that it had noticed Mr. Biden had been declared winner. The relationship between China and the U.S., the world's two biggest economies, is hugely consequential. A trade war initiated by President Trump had damaged relations and has his insistence on referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus or Kung flu. The two countries have also sparred over espionage, China's military build-up in the South China Sea, and the mass detention of Muslims in Western China. Meanwhile, Russia is also yet to offer its well wishes to Mr. Biden. 4 years ago, the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was among the first to congratulate Donald Trump on his election victory, but there has been no tweet, telegram, or phone call to Mr. Biden this time. So our Washington, D.C. correspondent Maria Bird joins us now for more on this. Maria, so let's begin with those comments from U.S. election officials that this vote was the most secure in American history. Is this likely to change the narrative, anything, at this point as the Trump campaign surges forward with even more legal challenges?
Yes, this is clearly a time when America is watching and they're waiting. But most importantly, what you've seen as you've described, this election was one that was very closely paid attention to by each and every state. And now let's just also preface the fact that the American election and the democracy in America has been longstanding for many years. And the processes that are taken to ensure safe, secure, legal, and law-abiding elections is one that's taken serious in each election. And this year we know that there were claims made prior to the time of voting by our president that this election would be potentially one of fraud, and there would be some challenges and there would be some illegal actions taking place. So each and every state made sure that they followed the guidelines, and even Republicans, as you stated, have said that this was one of the most secure elections, safely, well planned out, well thought out, and executed elections in American history. And we can see that by the numbers that went out to vote. Clearly, there were great initiatives put in place to ensure that every American had access to voting, and that every American would have the opportunity to exercise their right to vote.
Calls from a string of world leaders in recent days, the latest being China, but we've not heard from some other leaders, notably Russia, North Korea, and Brazil. Could it be that they aren't so excited about the Mr. Biden presidency, or what else could they be waiting for?
Well, as we know, North Korea was not an ally of the U.S. prior to the Trump administration. President Trump made very extreme measures to ensure that he reached over to North Korea to mend some ways that have not been strong for some time, just due to the South Korea-North Korea relationship. And so that relationship with the U.S., I think that North Korea is probably questioning moving forward due to the fact of the change of administration. We know that Russia, there was claims of meddling in the prior elections. We know that President Trump has had a long relationship with Russia, and so we would not expect them either to come out. Brazil is one that most recently that president has taken quite a bit of focus and liking of President Trump. So potentially Brazil is seeing that maybe their relationships or the things that they have planned for the U.S.-Brazilian relations will be potentially put at a pause moving forward. But that's three countries that we know that clearly have not necessarily been the long-term allies of the U.S. Brazil is one that I'm sure the U.S. will find ways to work with, even moving forward, even with a new administration.
And President Trump spent most of his tenure waging a war against China in terms of trade, and even going as far as blaming China for the coronavirus pandemic. Is Mr. Biden likely to continue this narrative, or is he likely to change his approach to the country?
President-elect Joe Biden has stood on the area of unity and the focus of unity. And the unity is not only creating a unit within the United States and within Americans trying to end the divide that exists. Unity is going to be global with his administration. There will be a focus on bringing unity amongst the world. We are in a world pandemic, as the president-elect has stated, and it is going to be imperative that the world begins to work together to address not only the healthcare crises, but the economic crises. And we know that our partners and allies across the world, such as China, are going to be key and critical into the recovery of our economy.
Okay, so let's get back to the elections proper, as we can, see some scenes there. Election officials have now started recounting votes by hand in Georgia, one of the disputed states. How will this work?
Well, they will physically go hand by hand. This is a very expensive, long, tedious process to actually count each vote by hand. This will be, literally, instead of putting it, typically our votes are put inside of a election machine that tabulates the votes, and then you receive a report from that. This will be actually someone taking that ballot, reading off each and every check that was made, and tabulating that into a system manually, and not just having the electronic version. And so we'll see how long that takes, but that is going to be a very labor-intensive process.
All right, thank you so much for that, our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Maria Bird.
Thank you for having me.
Let's move on. The mass resignation of Hong Kong's opposition lawmakers leaves the pro-democracy movement with no clear option in its fight against Communist Party rulers in Beijing. That's according to one of the outgoing legislators, Claudio Mo. Opposition members have tried to make a stand against what many people see as Beijing's whittling away of freedoms promised to Hong Kong under the one country, two systems formula under which it returned to China in 1997. China denies curbing rights and freedoms in the financial hub, but authorities in Hong Kong and Beijing have moved decisively to stifle dissent, especially with the national security legislation, which punishes what China broadly defines as subversion, secession, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces, with up to life in prison.
My first term was marked by the umbrella movement, and the second term defined by the anti-China extradition campaign. And there's so much fire, passion, tears, and blood. And it's very strenuous. And it seems that every time Hong Kong protesters, especially our young, would escalate their protest, Beijing would just tighten the snooze. And so we seem to be in a no-win situation. Do you not get faint-hearted? Now and then, I confess, I do. I did, certainly. But then you cannot let the enemy see you sweat, right? Well, I would claim that I was one of the key pioneers in the whole of Hong Kong, not just at LegCo. I started talking about localism. My localism is mainly about retaining the Hong Kong identity.
Meanwhile, China has issued a warning of retaliatory action against the United Kingdom and Australia during a stern rebuke of London and Canberra's criticism of Beijing's new rules disqualifying elected legislators in Hong Kong. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman says if the relevant countries obstinately cling to their course on this, China will issue a resolute, timely, and necessary response. Britain on Thursday said China had broken its main bilateral treaty on Hong Kong by imposing new rules to disqualify elected legislators in the former British colony, cautioning that it will consider sanctions as part of its response. The US, Germany, holder of the European Union's rotating presidency, and Australia have also condemned the oustings. The disqualifications were made possible after the Chinese parliament earlier adopted a resolution allowing the city's executive to expel lawmakers deemed to be advocating Hong Kong independence, colluding with foreign forces, or threatening national security without having to go through the courts. And France is holding ceremonies for the victims of the 2015 Paris attacks carried out by Islamic State militants. The shootings and bombings left 130 people dead and 350 wounded, the worst peacetime atrocity in decades. The gunman who stormed a rock concert killed 90 people after opening fire on fans packed in to hear the band Eagles of death metal. 5 years on, France is back on high alert after more jihadist attacks. Last month, history teacher Samuel Paty was murdered near his school in Paris. 3 people died days later in another lone wolf attack at a church in the southern city of Nice. In Ethiopia, the UN Human Rights Commission is warning that reports of mass killings in the country would, if verified, amount to war crimes. This comes after Amnesty International reported that scores of civilians had been killed in a town in Tigray state. Speaking in Geneva, Michelle Bachelet called for a full investigation and said those responsible must be held accountable. The authorities in Tigray have denied eyewitness reports that Tigrayan forces carried out the killings. Ms. Bachelet said that the first priority must be ending the fighting. Thousands of people are already fleeing the fighting into neighboring Sudan. A funeral prayer has been held for the former president of Mali, Amadou Toumani Touré, in Istanbul, Turkey. Former Malian President Touré, who won acclaim for pursuing democratic reforms before being toppled by a military coup in 2012, died at the age of 72. According to reports, the former president was flown to Turkey after undergoing a heart operation in Bamako. Mr. Touré's life in many ways symbolized the top-start nature of democracy in Mali, where his successor, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, was overthrown in another coup this August, widely known by his initials, ATT. Mr. Touré led an army coup in 1991 against military ruler Moussa Traoré after violent anti-government protests. He organized democratic elections the following year and handed over power to a civilian president, earning him the nickname Soldier of Democracy. And still to come on the program. Motorized broomstick turns heads in Brazil traffic. We'll have details in a moment. Thanks for staying with us. World Health Organization Chief Tedros Ghebreyesus says the world has a long way to go in managing the coronavirus pandemic and warns that countries should not rely solely on a vaccine. 11 months into the pandemic that has killed more than 1.2 million people, derailed economies and turned daily lives upside down around the world, he says relying on promising but as yet unproven vaccines is a risky bet. Mr. Ghebreyesus says instead the world needs to invest more and place a higher value on healthcare. On Monday, U.S. drug maker Pfizer and German partner BioNTech said a vaccine they are developing was 90% effective against COVID-19 based on initial results from large late-stage trial. The results need to be confirmed by safety data.
That a vaccine will be a vital tool for controlling the pandemic, and we're encouraged by the preliminary results of clinical trials released this week. Never in history has the vaccine research progressed so quickly. We must apply the same urgency and innovation to ensuring that all countries benefit from this scientific achievement. But we have a long way to go. The world cannot put all its eggs in one basket and neglect the many other tools at our disposal. Returning to the status quo is not an option. We don't just need more investments in public health. We must also rethink how we value health. The time has come for a new narrative that sees health not as a cost, but an investment. That's the foundation of productive, resilient, and stable economies.
In the meantime, Americans are being faced with the grim reality of restrictions as major spikes in the coronavirus are sweeping across the country. Let's get back to our Washington, D.C. correspondent, Maria Bird, to tell us more about this.
The U.S. is beginning to see a rolling back of the reopening in many states across the country as the COVID-19 death toll has escalated to over 242,000. The daily COVID-19 infection rates are increasing to over 150,000 new cases per day, and state officials are taking action.
It's just not safe. And it might not be safe for a while yet. Wisconsin, this is serious. The crisis is urgent.
Because our frontline medical personnel, our nurses and assistants and doctors, they're exhausted and overwhelmed and need us all to do the things that we can on the outside that will slow the number of patients that need hospitalization.
We all recommit to the common sense measures that got us past the first horrendous months of this pandemic. We are in for a long, dark winter.
We do not step up and do the things that we know actually work to protect ourselves, to protect our families, protect people in our network, protect our colleagues. By the end of this year, we will lose at least 1,000 more lives.
Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is outraged by the spike of cases and calls on the White House to do more.
And the Republicans in Congress have ignored, by delay, distortion, denial, deaths have been caused. And what are they doing now? Continuing to ignore in spite of these numbers.
While the novel coronavirus rages through the U.S. for a second time, the president-elect Biden administration's inability to work with current federal health officials may have an impact on timely vaccine delivery to millions of Americans. From Washington, Maria Bird, Channel Television News.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Australia will not allow foreign students to return to Canberra as it prioritizes the return of local stock overseas. Australia has since March closed its borders to all non-citizens and permanent residents in a bid to slow the spread of COVID-19. Meanwhile, early testing of a potential COVID-19 vaccine developed by an Australian university and CSL Limited, has shown it to be safe and produce an antibody response. And Australia has already agreed to buy 51 million doses of the University of Queensland developed candidate. Well, finally on the program, in the famously traffic-choked streets of Brazilian megalopolis Sao Paulo, two men have invented a novel way of getting from point A to B, and they're raising a lot of eyebrows in the process. On a recent weekend, Vinicius Santos and Alessandro Rosso could be seen coasting down the city's main thoroughfares on a pair of broomsticks, each one attached to a single motorized wheel. To steer, the duo simply lean in the direction they wish to travel. They say while it takes a bit of practice at first, the broomsticks, which can reach top speeds of 60 kilometers per hour, are useful for day-to-day urban living. So far, the brooms are largely limited to personal use, but Rosso and Sanctus have plans to market and sell the broomsticks, which cost about $743 each.
People on Harry Potter, they control the broom through leaning their body. So I thought, we already have vehicles that we control them through the balance of our body. So maybe if we could bring the control, not to your feet, but to the broom, maybe that will bring a very similar sensation of how people ride brooms on movies. Well, actually, I tell my friends that now I only go to the bakery using my broom. But it's not a joke, I actually do that. Like, I use my broom as a means of transportation nowadays, and it's so fun. Our final goal is to sell the brooms to the world and maybe create a new variation of the Quidditch sport, which will actually be played in brooms, and will look a lot like the one played in the Harry Potter movies.
Freeing. It's a freeing feeling. You feel like you're actually flying. You glide to the streets, you know? It kind of requires a lot of balance, but once you get it, it's pretty much amazing.
Well, in a world where it gets more difficult to fuel your cars, maybe that could be an option. Well, that's the world today. Thank you so much for watching. Joker Rogers on top of the hour. We'll have sports news at 6.